For a while, Henry Lucas and Ottis Toole were the infamous stars of the media and darlings of the police, drifting lovers who roamed America, raping, killing, cannibalising and committing necrophilia with hundreds of victims, but also willing to confess it all to law enforcement. As police rushed to clear crimes off their books, the pair confessed to murdering over 600 people, but there was a major problem. Almost everything they said was, if not an outright lie, then completely unreliable. They definitely killed a few people, but they were happy to give false confessions for comfort and food. They are called the confession killers, and there's a great deal of doubt still about all of their potential victims. The actual total is nowhere near 600, it's nowhere near 100, it may be 10 or less. Their case led to a change in the way law enforcement treated confessions, but Lucas and Toole perpetrated a double tragedy, both the lives they did take and the fact that they misled a law enforcement who were so desperate to go along with the, work of these killers, that hundreds of real killers were never caught, evidence was lost, families never got closure. Even now, there are calls to investigate almost everything they remain connected to. At times in this I will be slightly vague, referring to all the murders, because so much of that information is a shifting pattern of lies and misinformation that is revised every year. Ottis Toole. Even by the standards of serial killers, Ottis Toole had a troubled childhood. He was born on March 5th, 1947 in Jacksonville, Florida. His father was an alcoholic who was physically and mentally abusive. His mother called him Susan and dressed him as a girl. He was sexually abused by his family and their friends from a very young age, and would later claim his grandmother taught him Satanism, although, as with most things he said, that may well not be true. He knew he was gay aged 10, began an affair when he was 12, and started going to gay bars instead of school. He struggled with education and had frequent epileptic seizures. Toole's first criminal acts may have been when he discovered setting fires aroused him and he became an arsonist. He claimed that, having become a prostitute, he committed his first murder when he was 14, when he killed a prospective male client with their car. His first arrest was in 1965 for loitering. He left the area of his youth and travelled around the southwest of the US, begging and selling sex. In 1974 he was in Nebraska and was a major suspect when a young woman called Patricia Webb was killed, but he swiftly left the area and moved to Boulder, where he became the major suspect when Ellen Hoffman was called. He quickly left the area. By 75 he was back in Jacksonville and actually married. He did this to conceal the fact he was gay, but he wasn't very good at it because she left him after 3 days, having realised he was gay. Henry Lee Lucas. Henry Lucas was born August 23rd, 1936. His father had lost both legs in a train accident. He was the youngest of 9 children and they lived in a one-room cabin. When he was 8, his mother beat him into a 3-day coma. When he was 10, he lost an eye after a brother wounded him and his mother ignored the damage. His mother frequently beat him and made him watch her having sex with the clients she had as she worked as a prostitute. She also dressed him as a girl to sell him for sex. He was roundly shunned at school, and his father died in 1951 after getting drunk and passing out in a blizzard. As soon as he could, Lucas left the family home and became a drifter. He had a sexual affair with a half-brother and started having sex with animals. In 1952 he was found guilty of burglary and sentenced to 2 years, and in 1954 sentenced to 4 for another crime, eventually being freed in 1959 after escaping for 3 days in the middle. Lucas claimed he first killed in 1951. The victim was 17-year-old Laura Burnsley, who disappeared waiting for a bus. Lucas claimed he picked her up and, when she refused sex, he tried to rape her, strangled her and buried her body. Now, while Laura was real and really did go missing, Lucas would go back and forth on this confession, and there's no evidence of what actually happened to her and nothing to connect the two besides Lucas's very unreliable statement. However, in 1959 he murdered his mother, which was definitely true. Lucas started living with his half-sister and was engaged to a pen pal he'd been writing to from prison. Lucas's mother visited for Christmas and demanded he drop the marriage and move back with her to look after her. They argued frequently until Lucas's mother hit him with a broom. In return, he stabbed her in the neck and ran away. The half-sister found the mother alive, but she died before help could come. Lucas was arrested, having made it to Ohio, and he claimed self-defense, blaming her abuse. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. While inside, he tried to commit suicide several times. He was sent to Iona State Hospital and given electric shock treatment, among other things, and this is where it should have ended. He should have been in prison for 40 years and not really done anything else. Unfortunately, in 1970, he was deemed suitable for release to ease overcrowding. Even just over a year later, when he tried to abduct a teenage girl, he only received a few years in prison. While serving this latter sentence, he once again formed a romance with a pen pal called Betty Crawford. On release, he married her, moved to Maryland and lived with her and her daughters. But the marriage fell apart the next year because Lucas was, perhaps inevitably, abusing the girls. Toole and Lucas met for the first time in 1976 in Jacksonville at a soup kitchen. They fast became friends and most probably romantic partners. Lucas moved in with Toole's mother in Florida, and the pair worked together for roofers. Lucas made friends with Toole's 11-year-old niece Frida Becky Powell, but essentially he groomed her and he began to abuse her. According to Toole and Lucas, but perhaps not really, the pair began committing murders together, travelling around the state, torturing, murdering, and sometimes eating prostitutes, hitchhikers, and others. Powell may have been involved in all of this, helping them procure victims. What definitely did happen was on January 4th, 1982, a 65-year-old man called George Sonnenberg was deliberately trapped in a boarding house which was set on fire. He died a week later from terrible injuries. After his later arrest, Toole would sign a confession that he and Sonnenberg had been lovers, fallen out, and that Toole had deliberately killed him through the fire. Toole had been a maintenance man at the building, and his confession was the only thing in the later trial that actually linked him. This is true. However, shortly after, Toole's mother died and Powell was placed in a state shelter. On January 20th, Lucas and Powell just vanished. Authorities had been concerned about Powell's lifestyle, presumably the fact she was being abused and helping in murders. So Lucas had talked her into escaping the shelter and fleeing. They went to California, where a job led the pair to work for 82-year-old Kate Rich. They were soon fired for not actually doing any work and indeed engaging in fraud. They hitchhiked on and caught a ride with a minister of the House of Prayer commune, where they claimed to be married, and he thought this was great. They were given work and a home on the commune. Powell wanted to go back to Florida. Lucas was scared of going back and losing her, and for now we'll just say she vanished. Lucas told everyone she had left him. During this period, Toole back home was livid Lucas and Powell had run off together and was considering his own murder spree. In April 1983, Toole was arrested for the arson we've discussed. He was soon to be found guilty and sentenced to 20 years. He confessed then to killing Sonnenberg. He also confessed to the unsolved murders of David Shallart and Arda Johnson. Shallart's body had been found at the side of the I-10, having been shot in the head. Toole claimed he had picked him up while hitchhiking, shot him and dumped him. Johnson was found shot dead near Fort Walton Beach, and Toole stated he'd forced her away from a nightclub and done much the same thing. 2 months later, Henry was arrested for unlawful possession of a gun by the Texas Rangers in Stoneburg on June 11th, 1983. As well as the gun, police wanted to speak to him about the disappearances of Powell and Rich, who had seemingly vanished. He wrote to the sheriff on his arrest something the sheriff had not even remotely been expecting, that I have killed for the past 10 years and no one will believe me. I cannot go on doing this. I also killed the only girl I ever loved. He freely confessed to the police that he had killed Powell and Rich. He claimed he took Powell into a field, stabbed her to death, had sex with her corpse, which he described as the best sex they ever had, and then cut her into pieces. He continued to claim throughout this that he had really loved Becky. He then lured Rich into a search for Becky and stabbed Rich to death, cut shapes into the corpse, had sex with that, and buried her in a drain pipe. Worried it would be found, he later retrieved the body and burned it piece by piece. Lucas willingly took the Rangers to the places where the bodies or ashes were, and things were found, but the remains could not be positively identified as either of the women. Yet the fact Lucas had taken them to these sites convinced the police that he's done these murders and that all his confessions that were coming were going to be real. They thought he was cooperating. Lucas was put in jail but tried to kill himself. He alleged the police tortured him until he confessed to the murders. And then he changed his mind yet again. When Lucas was in court for the arraignment, he rejected legal advice and began to say in court that he'd had sex with Rich's corpse and cut it up, and that he'd killed at least 100 more people. I know it ain't normal for a person to go out and kill girls just to have sex with them, he added. This completely changed things for the police and for everybody else. They started to ask him, who are these people? Lucas began to be very, very forthcoming in the interviews, grandly explaining about a vast killing spree he and Toole had been on. Police went back to Toole for confirmation. He initially denied it all, but then quickly started endorsing everything Lucas was saying. The Lucas task force was established to gain the full details, and as long as he kept confessing to the killings, they were nice to him, taken to restaurants, not handcuffed, allowed to free roam of the jail. He was even given access to the actual files of the crimes he then confessed to. Conferences of police officers were organised so people could gather and present him with their cases, including a 3-day event that saw 107 officers from 18 states. A timetable of phone calls was also drawn up. Soon the pair had confessed to over 600 murders and explained they'd obeyed the orders of the Hands of Death, a powerful cult. Lucas claimed the cult was rich, powerful, connected to organised crime and practiced sacrifice, trained the pair into killers who did what they'd been asked. While in prison, the pair were taped having a conversation that had been arranged between the two where they openly discussed their cannibalism. Remember one time I said I wanted me some ribs, did that make me a cannibal? And discussed eating people with barbecue sauce. However, not everyone in law enforcement was convinced, such as a force in Delaware where their suspect for another murder already in custody had also confessed. The most controversial murder confessed to by Lucas and Toole was that of 6-year-old Adam Walsh, who went missing in 1981. Toole claimed he lured the child into his car with sweets in a bar parking lot, drove him away, beat him up and cut his head off with a machete. Toole claimed he drove round with the head for a few days before dumped it into a canal. Somehow, police managed to lose Toole's entire car before evidence could be gleaned from it, and why Toole was by far the major suspect in this investigation. It ran into a metaphorical wall in 1981, having been unable to find any DNA evidence because they lost the evidence. The local police announced they were closing the case as everyone involved were satisfied what they did have pointed to Toole. Hollywood Police Chief Chadwick Wagner would say, "Our agency has devoted an inordinate amount of time seeking leads to other potential perpetrators, rather than emphasising Ottis Toole as our primary suspect." Toole was put on trial for the murder of Sonnenberg and on April 28, 1984, was found guilty and given the death penalty. But there was a problem that had started nagging away at some people. During the trial, Toole stated he'd only signed the confession to be extradited to Jacksonville. The police could find no evidence of the existence of the Hands of Death, and the whole nature of the murder seemed unbelievable. Yet, Toole was charged in the same year with strangling a teenager to death in Tallahassee, convicted and given a second death sentence, although both these death sentences were later appealed to life. He received 4 more life sentences in 1991 when he pled guilty to 4 more murders in Florida: Mary McCary, Geraldine Peoples, Brenda Jo Burton, and former Malone Mayor John P. McDaniel Sr. The state considered putting Lucas on trial as well, but it decided it would be too much, as Lucas was currently on death row in Texas. Lucas eventually was sentenced to death for 11 murders, including his mother, Powell, and Rich. One of these, A victim whose identity was known as Orange Socks, until she was actually identified, was Deborah Louise Jackson. She was 23, murdered on either October 30th or 21st, 1979 in Georgetown, Texas, strangled and found naked apart from her orange socks. However, although he was sentenced for this, documents suggested Lucas was far away from, at the time, working. That death sentence was reduced when people began to realise Lucas had seen the file in the Orange Socks case before he'd been interviewed and confessed about it. So, what am I talking about here? Well, doubts continued. On April 23rd, 1984, Lucas began saying he'd made it all up, then began saying he'd done it all and the cult were going to kill him. Hugh Ainsworth of the Dallas Times-Herald led a dedicated team which examined maps, work records, traffic tickets, checks, and interviewed many people, and worked out that the killers, in order to fulfill part of their vast claim of 600 murders, in 1 month would have had to have done an 11,000-mile spree in no sleep, covering 370 miles a day in a car, to have killed everyone they claimed. They confirmed that on a day when Lucas claimed to be committing a murder in Texas, he was physically present in Illinois claiming food stamps. Another Texas murderman who was proven to be working on a Pennsylvania farm. A Nevada murder when Lucas made a financial transaction in Jacksonville selling scrap metal. Not even Lucas and Toole could be in two different places at once. People began to believe that Lucas was just a very pliant interviewee who police were feeding information that he would confess to, and that Toole was just a mad fantasist who'd make things up. To back Lucas up, it is entirely possible that many, if not almost all, of Lucas and Toole's murders were just cases of the police trying to clean their files up and not really looking very hard. The pair killed some people, but they didn't kill anyone near everyone. Instead, Lucas was happily confessing, so he kept being treated to dinners out. The police did fire back at Ainsworth. It's no hoax, Sheriff Jim Bootwell said. Lucas has not been able to pull a hoax on all these people. He's tried it from time to time. We're kind of like reporters. We're a little cynical. We like to see something proven being factual. No man is going to continue to pull a hoax on hundreds of seasoned officers. I think Ainsworth is going to wind up with a lot of egg on his face on this thing. I'm not too concerned. Although it turned out it was very much the police with the eggs on their faces. That quote is from the killer who recanted in the Washington Post. To be fair to the police, in April 1986, Texas Attorney General Jim Mattox oversaw the Lucas report, which took a full-scale look at where Lucas and Toole could be confirmed to be. This timeline wiped out a huge chunk of the confessions in one go. Mattox stated, questions about Henry Lee Lucas will be debated for decades. This report is not offered as a final answer. There may never be a final answer. I just hope that through our efforts, the real murders of innocent victims will be brought closer to justice by a careful re-examination of Lucas's contrived confessions. After this, the treatment of prisoners and the manner of extracting confessions changed. People would not be given access to files to refresh their memory and see if anyone in them rang a bell. They would not be able to study up and then confess to things they had nothing to do with. But again, to be balanced, I have to explain the Rangers did not all take this at all well. The Lucas report had plenty of work from District Attorney Vic Feasel. Vic started to doubt Lucas when the latter confessed to killing Jocelyn Calvin. Feasel had already locked someone up for killing Calvin, and his team did all the work to examine the situation properly, proving Lucas was in a different part of the country at the time. Lucas also confessed to the rape and murder of Vita Salazar and Frank Key in Feasel's jurisdiction, but Vic refused to take the easy route to glory and looked into the case, concluding Lucas was faking it. But he also found something else. In an interview with Esquire, he explains how his work as DA was actively interfered with. When they attempted to digitally look up the killer's files in the state and national crime database, they were greeted with access denied messages. That has never happened before, Feasel tells me. The national database shutdown was particularly alarming, and that scared us, he says. We knew we were in pretty deep, because how could we understand how they might cut off our access in Texas? But how could they do it nationally? That's from an Esquire article called Henry Lee Lucas was considered America's most prolific serial killer. Since then, Feasel dedicated himself to working out what was going on. He still runs a database tracking and updating Lucas's report, but at the time he became a target of a livid and embarrassed police force who tried to stitch him up, basically. We may never know the real truth, but estimates of the pair's spree, revised by investigation and time, for instance the arrival of DNA has ruled out 20 killings so far, ranged from 40 down to just 3. For instance, Lucas was convicted of the murder of Laura Purchase. She was 26 when she went missing on March 5th, 1983, and her body was found in burning woodland on the 17th. She had been raped and strangled, but in 2008, DNA testing revealed that Lucas was not the killer. Fortunately, in this case, a renewed police investigation was able to get a new suspect in 2021. The lies of Lucas and Toole have cost police and families the chance to find real killers. For instance, the case of Catherine Martin. She was found dead, tied up, stabbed 17 times, strangled, and an eye had been smashed out with a hammer in February 18, 1982. The investigation began to zero in on truck drivers and surface staff. But then another part of the investigation, who'd gone to one of the mass questioning events of Lucas and Toole, got a signed confession from Toole. Toole was charged with first-degree murder, but it became apparent Toole hadn't done it, and by then the evidence gathered, including the murder weapons, had once again been lost. Martin's murder sadly remains unsolved to this day, the chance lost because people switched the focus to Toole. In the 2010s, Taki Oldham and Robert Kenner started working on a documentary about the confession killers, which came out on Netflix with that title. They soon found this wasn't going to be the story of the killers. We're really trying to give the family members as much of a voice as possible. To us it's a project and it means a lot, but to these people, this is their lives. They've been living with this for 40 years. The pair dug into the case in huge depth and feel able to say certainly dozens of cases where either killers were walking free because they're still credited to Lucas, or a dozen more cases that were never properly reinvestigated because it was credited to Lucas. While there is work in reopening these cases, pushed in part by the success of the documentary, the reluctance of the police to talk about controversial cases where they may have done wrong in the past was certainly something that we encountered. Quotes from The Guardian in 5th December 2019. However, many law enforcement officers are re-examining decisions made several decades ago. Bakersfield police in California reopened the investigation into the murder of Linda Adkins, who was found dumped by a highway in '79 and claimed by Lucas. They have called for people to come forward. The Utah Cold Case Coalition went through all files on the death of Leah Sharp, who was 26 when she was raped and murdered in '78, and who Lucas said at times he both did and didn't kill. They found forensic evidence that should back then have ruled him out and did now. The local province police were convinced and reopened the case. Karen Porter of the UCCC has a simple message for all US police: reopen everything about Lucas. Her quote is, because every case that Henry Lee Lucas falsely confessed to is a cold case, it has not been solved. There have been modern successes. In 1980, Kathleen O'Brien Doyle was found raped, stabbed and choked to death with a cord in her home, while her husband was away in the Navy. A local police sergeant got a confession from Lucas that he and Toole did it, and they felt forensic evidence matched well enough to charge Lucas. However, the case fell apart, and modern police reopened it and arrested 70-year-old Dennis Lee Narum for the murder. Doyle's father has long been critical of a myopic investigation, and after the arrest stated, "It is my opinion that my daughter's case might have been solved long ago if only the Norfolk Police Department had not been duped into believing a national-scale hoax perpetrated by Henry Lee Lucas." A situation repeated perhaps hundreds of times. The scale of the problem is summed up by Canner. If we were to take a conservative estimate, 70 to 100 cases are still crediting Lucas for the crime, whether formally or informally. Probably 106 to 170 were never reinvestigated, which is an incredible number. That probably means there's at least over 100 killers who stayed free. Hugh Ainsworth's study for the Dallas Times-Herald came to the damning conclusion: all their research, and this is the quote, suggests that Lucas cannot have been responsible for most, perhaps no more than 3 of the slayings credited to him. Even the most rudimentary of investigations was not done by authorities. He always told me he only killed 3 people from the first night I met him. I thought it was BS at first. Not everyone doubts Lucas. A Brownfield journalist looked into the killing of 17-year-old Diana Bryant in 1981, a case which had long been closed and attributed to Lucas. There was enough doubt raised about this case that the police considered reinvestigating it, but the victim's father said he was happy with the confession and didn't want the case reopened. Toole died in prison of psoriasis on September 15, 1996. Lucas died in prison too of heart failure in March 2001. Let's leave the final word to Vic Feasel. We urge all law enforcement agencies with closed Lucas cases to reopen them. It's the right thing to do. Oh, there is one final problem though, and that's the resurrection of Becky Powell. No, not in the way you're thinking. In October 1992, the now adult Becky Powell presented herself to police and said Lucas hadn't killed her. He didn't want her implicated in the crime, so he said she was dead. But it wasn't Powell, it was a 40-year-old woman called Phyllis Wilcox. She had begun corresponding with Lucas while he was in prison and then begun visiting him. He told her he had only ever killed his mother, that Powell was alive somewhere, avoiding the involvement in their crimes, and that he loved Wilcox. Wilcox felt she loved him too, and devised a plan to stop him from being executed. She would pretend to be Powell. She did do this, but her claims didn't survive police scrutiny, and the ruse was discovered. In 2002, writer Ryan McMichael published an interview he conducted with Wilcox on his lays.net site. Ryan wasn't sure if publishing such a conversation was the right thing to do, and the webpage no longer exists. But Wilcox explained why she started writing. I thought it would be interesting to get letters from him, just to see what he had to say. Well, his letters were so friendly, and the only murder that he said he committed was the one where he killed his mother. I got to the point where Henry was all that was on my mind, 24 hours. I even dreamed about it when I slept. It was all I talked about at work. It got so bad that my boss at work told me to find another job on the count of it. I wrote and told Henry that I think I'm falling in love with him, and told him about being on my mind 24 hours. He wrote back telling me that he was having the same feelings towards me. I knew I had to meet this man and see if my feelings were real. Well, after my first meeting, my feelings for Henry were stronger than ever. I had really fallen in love with him, and I had to fight to keep Texas from taking him away from me.